Hey, what's up, everyone? Mark Solo Games. Today we're going to talk about Alchemy. Yeah, I don't talk about Arena too much on my channel. Most of the time, we're talking about finance. We're talking about how WotC screws us over, but rarely do I talk about Arena. And the reason is because honestly, I just don't play that much Arena anymore. I used to be a pretty bit into Arena. It was easy, accessible. I could play it without having to show up to a LGS. And of course, during COVID, it's like the easiest way to play Magic without having to go anywhere. The issue, of course, is just like I think Arena, like a lot of mobile games, over time became more of a chore for me, less of enjoyment. I felt like I need to log into Arena, or else my quest would stack up. I'm losing gold because I'm not doing the quest. It's some weird like psychological things. I just don't like being manipulated. So at some point, I think around Strixhaven, I just stopped playing Arena. So I haven't really touched Arena for 2 years now or so. Honestly, don't feel anything. It's fine. But today we're going to talk about Alchemy and why I think Alchemy is a really bad decision by WotC. And I don't understand why we're still continuing forward on this. So let's first talk stats. So Arena just had an Arena Championship, and this was, I think, they were running a historic Alchemy as the format. And I think viewership basically just really tanked. I don't know what the standard viewership for Arena tournaments are. I suspect it's not high, but 6K only for this Arena Championship game just feels really low. Compare that to the Pro Tour Pioneer Finals, right? That I think had like 39K at peak. So 40K, I think it's like 39.7 or something, 40K viewership at peak. So you can see the factor is like almost like a 7x factor of difference. That's pretty huge, right? And that tells me something, which is people in general don't like Arena. Probably watching Arena is really difficult, and that could definitely be attributing to why there's just less people watching this tournament. Because again, spectator mode doesn't exist. Most of the streamers have to or the people who are casting have to jam two windows together. It really it's a very funky client to have spectator for. The other part is also, again, just still Arena is, befuddled with bugs. And again, animations slow things down, etc. There's just a lot of problems with Arena as far as playing Magic in that mode. But today we're going to focus on what I think is actually the core problem, which is Alchemy. It's the game format, not necessarily anything about the client, which again, they have problems, but that's not it. So I think overall, Alchemy is a really bad decision for WotC. For Magic. And the reason is because that essentially Alchemy seeks to divide the community into two. They're going to have two sets of different cards that you understand. There's going to be two sets of different rules, right? And so when I mention rules, a lot of people are thinking like, what do you mean two sets of different rules? Well, if you think back on the original design of Magic, which is what Richard Garfield envisioned, which is a very simple set of rules, and the rest of the rules are on the card. So you only have to worry about those rules as the cards are being played. And then you can read the card and you can understand, okay, well, how are we modifying the game now, right? So as an example, an enchantment that says something like, hey, no player can cast more than one spell, right? Normally, the rule says if you have the mana, you can cast as many spells as you want, as long as you have the cards, you have the mana to pay for it, you're good to go. But this enchantment would change that rule. And so you don't have to worry about an enchantment like this existing until somebody casts it. And I think that's actually one of the reasons why Magic is so accessible, because it's very easy to have the very, very basics. And then, of course, just the rules get modified as cards come into play. And that's only then do you have to really worry about it, which is really nice. And while I agree, the rules of Magic today is pretty long. It's 278 pages now. I think most of that is just for clarifications for cards, though. So, for example, they're explaining what different keywords mean, banding, etc. No one knows what banding does still, I think. Do you guys know what banding is? Tell me in the comments if you know. Without looking it up. You got to tell me what banding does without looking it up. And then tell me what banding does on defense. All right. Yeah, so the rules today, while they're long, it's mostly to explain what the cards do, basically over clarifying the keywords and things written on a card, and then of course adding in any necessary rulings where it's like, hey, because of two interactions of two different cards, how would they actually interact together? You want to write that into the rules so that there's no ambiguity going in the future. But again, I think if you take out all those pieces, the game is still fairly simple. Basically, the rules would just need to explain what mana is, the different phases, what happens in a turn, etc. So I think it's fine. But Alchemy, of course, shatters this part because it seeks to kind of send and create a separate set of rules because their cards, again, the cards are the rules, do different things. Now, there are very cool effects that only Alchemy can do, right? So there are digital only cards that Alchemy kind of works. For example, go to this weird deck and search for this card. Right? Like they're really true Alchemy only cards. I think it's kind of interesting for that aspect because I think a game where the cards change or the cards have special effects that can only happen in digital is interesting. But I also think that doesn't have to exist and really can't exist in Magic. And because, the problem with Magic is that Magic has essentially one set of cards, which are the physical cards, and now we're creating a second set, but they're the same cards. So I think if the game Magic is digital only or paper only, I think it works fine. The problem is when you have two different formats and then the cards don't match with each other. That's where it's not fine, and that's where it causes a lot of confusion. That's what the problems with Alchemy is. Okay, moving on to the second part about Alchemy. I think the problem is it's really missing the target audience. So when I was coaching startups about 5 years ago, one of the things that we always talk to the founders is, hey, what is your product market fit? Really understanding that part of it, right? And so the idea would just be, who are you trying to sell this product to? Who is your target audience? And what do they actually want? Why would they want to buy your product? A lot of times, you get different answers, but when I look at the product market fit for Alchemy, I'm really confused, right? I don't know who the target market is. If we say we're targeting spikes, the people who are tournament grinders, it kind of makes sense on the surface, right? Because we're having very balanced cards, and these cards can be rebalanced as we go. Because if we see any problems, we don't need to ban the cards, we just need to modify them or increase the power level of certain lower tier cards, right? And that makes sense for a lot of, this is what Hearthstone as a game does, right? So it totally makes sense. However, the problem with these people is that, see, the professionals, they don't really want to learn two different games. They definitely don't want to learn two sets of rules for the same game. And this is the problem. It's very confusing, right? For a game that's already very vast, has many, many different cards, it's a lot of work to have to understand, okay, when I'm looking at this card that looks like this and is white spell is very similar, but it doesn't do this thing. We already have a memory problem with Magic, right? How many games nowadays can you play where you don't have to read opponent's cards? It's very hard, right? And so for professionals, this is the same problem. Now imagine they're already very familiar with a card. But and the reason they're familiar with that card, let's say in paper, is because that card is very strong. But let's say it doesn't do the same thing in Alchemy. Well, that's going to be a big problem because they may not read the card and think it does what it does, and in fact, it does something different. And that's a problem, right? So again, it's not really for the professionals who may want to just play one game instead of two, right? So what about older players, like people who are, like maybe, I've been playing Magic for many years. I'm kind of bored of the current way the cards work. I don't think it's for them either, because a lot of these old players, they want to play paper Magic. They don't even care about Arena at all, right? And they play MTG because it's essentially like a tie-in to the paper Magic. One-to-one for the cards, the formats, etc. So that makes sense to them. But it really doesn't make sense for there to be another set of cards that they now have to remember. It's the same problem as I think the spikes, the competitive players. What about new players? Could the market be for new players? Well, at first I was thinking maybe this is true too, because for new players, you don't want to go into a game where you feel like certain cards they picked are just not good. But it's almost part of Magic that certain cards are designed to be not good. Mark Rosewater talked about this. In Draft, they intentionally put cards that are not good, right? Off rate, whatever. So players can make mistakes, and then newer players can make those mistakes and learn from it. And that's part of the growth of Magic. As you become a better player, you start understanding, what is on rate? What is off rate? Why is this card worse than this card? These kind of things become a little bit more intuitive to you, and that's intentional. So I guess that's one way to say why Draft Chaff exists. right? Is because of this. And I would say even then, even with draft chaff, there are some cards that you don't even pick in a draft because it's just really bad. Like it's a very low tier pick, right? And that's intentional too. So I'm not sure if this is really for new players though, because let's say we rebalance Alchemy. The new players who may, for example, play Alchemy exclusively for a couple months, then when they move over to the paper game, they're not going to know what's going on. They're going to look at the game and say, that's not the game I knew. That card doesn't do that thing. So it's not really for them. In addition to that, we actually have introductory product, whether it be starter decks, event decks, pre-cons. In fact, some stores will just give you a deck and then you can play and they'll teach you. So do we really need Alchemy as introductory product for Magic players, especially when it's not even the same game? Like they're going to play Alchemy and then ask, why does that card not exist? Or why does that card not do this thing that it does on my Arena client on my phone, right? Doesn't make any sense. And so, of course, now we come to the other problem with Alchemy. It's an identity issue. Magic is already a large game. There's a lot of times now with all the variants of artwork, variants of, like different cards, number of cards, sheer number, volume of cards. I don't recognize cards most of the time, especially when you're playing Commander. Now, if you add in Alchemy cards, right, and it's like, if I think this card does this, but it actually does something else, you can see how confusing that is. And it's already confusing with all the variances. We're adding one more tier of variance. Like, is this the Alchemy version or the normal version? It's kind of annoying to have to even deal with that. So the recognition issue, I think, is a problem. And lastly, I think Alchemy is a bad idea just simply because I have concerns whether this is hurting overall Magic design. While most people probably would say, look, Alchemy can be ignored. We don't have to worry about it. If you don't like it, don't play it, right? This kind of mentality. Well, I think there's two problems. One is I don't think I can ignore it. And I don't think just because I, ignore it, don't play with it, that won't bleed into mainline products. I think Alchemy in some ways is like an unset. They're testing different mechanics, and those mechanics may make it into production or mainline product, paper products at some point, right? There's number one. Number two, designing Magic, R&D as a whole, is a limited resource. So there's let's say there's 50 people at R&D. There's just 50 people. There's not going to be 51 people. So whoever you're putting on the Alchemy team, they can't be on the design team. So that's a problem too. So if they're spending all this effort designing Alchemy, rebalancing Alchemy, is that effort better spent, maybe perhaps like designing Magic, the paper product instead? Focus on one product instead of two. So in conclusion, I just think Alchemy is not the right thing for Magic and WotC to focus on right now. I think at first it's bisecting the player base, it's creating two sets of rules and adding more confusion to an already large game that is starting to have pretty serious identity problems with different text on cards, with different artwork that causes people to not recognize the game. In addition to that, I don't think Alchemy has the right understanding of who the audience it's trying to target is. I don't think the people that it thinks is trying to sell the game to is actually appreciative of what's happening and what's being added to Alchemy. And lastly, I just think resources financially, it doesn't make any sense, right? Could we send more of the resource that is being spent on Alchemy over to the mainline card game and make a better card game there? Sure. And are there going to be different things that come out of Alchemy that actually could be negative for the game? Would they bleed through to the game, to the card version of the game? That could definitely happen as well. So these things I'm definitely concerned about. And I'm more concerned also about WotC's in general inability to recognize that they're wrong and then make actual changes. So I see people, they're still going forward with Alchemy, even though, again, viewership and all the other data that we have currently is just showing that Alchemy is really not performing well, and still more resources are being spent there. So there's that. That's going to do it for me for today. Mark, Solar Games. I'll see you guys later. I hope you have fun and good luck on drafting, and stay classy.